Welcome back to Growth Trap. For generations, there was this absolutely proven, rock-solid formula for a poor country to get rich. You just build factories. You take workers out of subsistence farming, move them onto the manufacturing floor, export those goods, boost your productivity, and boom, you climb the economic ladder. I mean, it worked perfectly for Britain, it worked for the US, it worked for Japan. But today, for a huge chunk of the global south, that ladder is literally missing. The traditional path to wealth is just vanishing right before our eyes.
So we have to ask ourselves, why exactly are developing nations losing their factories way before they actually get rich? Let's dive right into this explainer. What we're looking at here is a massive, profound macroeconomic shift. Across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia, countries are seeing their industrial sectors just shrink. But the real shocker here isn't just that factories are closing down, it's the timing. Why shed manufacturing jobs when your population is still overwhelmingly poor? The harsh reality is they're getting stuck in a very real, very stubborn structural growth trap.
To really grasp this, let's compare two completely different eras. Take the early industrializers, places like the US, Britain, and Germany. For them, their manufacturing sectors peaked when they were already pretty well off. In Western Europe, for example, industrialization didn't hit its ceiling until income levels reached around $14,000 per capita. But for today's developing nations, the story is completely flipped. In so many of these countries, manufacturing peaks incredibly early and then just collapses. And we're talking about collapses happening at income levels as painfully low as $700.
Economists actually have a name for this. It's called premature deindustrialization. You see, historically, manufacturing has been the absolute undisputed engine of economic development. Why? Because it's highly productive, it scales beautifully, and most importantly, it can absorb massive amounts of low-skill labor. So, when a developing country loses this engine too early, they aren't just losing exports. They're losing their primary mechanism for boosting productivity and raising wages for everybody. Honestly, it's like trying to climb to the second floor of a building, but somebody just kicked out the middle rungs of your ladder.
Section 1. Mechanisms of Industrial Decline. The structural forces destroying the factory floor.
So what's actually driving this? What is actively destroying the factory floor across the global south? Well, we can point to three main structural drivers. First up is globalization, and specifically the meteoric rise of China as the world's ultimate manufacturing powerhouse. For latecomers trying to get into the game, competing with that level of scale and efficiency is nearly impossible. Second is automation. Robots and advanced tech mean that having cheap labor just isn't the massive competitive advantage it used to be. This actually lets rich countries reshore their production back home. And third, rapid trade liberalization. When a lot of these developing nations suddenly stripped away their protective tariffs, their local infant industries were instantly drowned by a tidal wave of hyper-competitive global imports.
Then we have to talk about another incredibly powerful constraint, the Dutch disease. Now remember, this isn't some sort of moral failing. It's just cold, hard economic mechanics. Here's how it works. When a country strikes it big with natural resources, think oil, coal, or gold, and starts exporting them, a massive flood of foreign currency rushes into the economy. And what that does is it causes the domestic currency to become chronically overvalued.
And because that local currency is now so artificially strong, it suddenly becomes incredibly expensive to actually produce manufactured goods domestically. It's just way cheaper to buy them from abroad. So paradoxically, a massive, lucrative boom in exporting raw materials effectively crushes the competitiveness of your local factories. It makes importing a breeze, but renders local production totally unviable. It just accelerates the whole deindustrialization process.
Just look at the sheer scale of this problem on this map here. Notice those stark red areas? Those are regions facing the most severe premature industrial decline. You can clearly see these massive vulnerabilities clustered right across Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. We are talking about entire regions where the industrial base is shrinking at income levels way lower than anything we've seen historically.
Moving on to Section 2, Real-World Case Studies, the Political Economy of Stalled Growth.
Okay, let's ground this in reality and contrast two very different outcomes. On one hand, we have Bangladesh. They actually managed to dodge this trap. How? Through hyper-focused export specialization. They doubled down on ready-made garments, bringing a massive female labor force into the formal economy to maintain their global competitiveness. But on the other hand, look at Brazil. Hit incredibly hard by both rapid trade liberalization and massive commodity booms, Brazil basically deindustrialized before reaching even half of U.S. income levels. They ended up sliding backward into a low-productivity, commodity-dependent state with totally stagnant wages.
And we see variations of this stalled growth everywhere. Take India. They tried to leapfrog the factory phase entirely and jump straight into IT and services. But while their GDP looks great on paper, it's creating what we call jobless growth because the tech and service sectors just don't absorb enough low-skilled labor. Then there's South Africa. Their manufacturing actually peaked back in the early 90s. Since then, high energy costs and currency spikes from commodity booms have just gutted their industry. And over in Indonesia, despite some really strong industrial pushes back in the 80s, massive commodity booms in coal and palm oil ended up shifting all the focus away from factories, completely stalling their industrial momentum.
Across Africa, the constraints are just as structural. Ethiopia actually tried a very deliberate, state-led industrial policy. They built special economic zones specifically to attract light manufacturing. But sadly, that progress has been severely derailed by political instability and serious foreign exchange shortages. Meanwhile, in Nigeria and Ghana, heavy exports of oil and gold triggered textbook cases of Dutch disease, which effectively hollowed out their domestic agriculture and manufacturing. And Kenya? They've built this amazing, thriving IT sector, the famous Silicon Savannah, but their actual manufacturing base is stagnating at around 8 to 10% of GDP, so they're left as a services-rich but industry-poor economy.
Which brings us to Section 3, the development trap, the lived outcomes of the missing ladder.
You see, macroeconomic theory always translates directly into lived human outcomes, and the absolute most crucial data point here is this number right here, 30%. That is South Africa's structural unemployment rate. Think about that. When a country loses its manufacturing base early, it loses the exact type of jobs that historically pulled masses of people out of poverty. You end up with this massive surplus of labor that the local services sector simply cannot absorb. It essentially locks a full third of the workforce out of the formal economy entirely.
So, the lived outcomes for much of the Global South are, quite frankly, pretty dire. Premature deindustrialization leads straight to chronic structural unemployment and stagnant wages. And it goes deeper than that. Without a growing, formal industrial base to tax and regulate, a government-state capacity inevitably weakens. Ultimately, these countries find themselves totally locked in a middle-income trap. They're stuck. They can't compete with the super low-wage agricultural economies, and they definitely can't compete with the high-tech, advanced economies.
Let's look at Section 4, Solutions for the Future, Rebuilding the Ladder.
Now, I want to be clear, this is not a story of inevitable doom. Developing nations are actively out there trying to construct a new ladder. So what are the actual solutions? First, governments need to implement highly targeted industrial policies, using things like special economic zones to bypass their own infrastructure deficits. Second, as we saw with Bangladesh, pursuing really narrow focused export specialization absolutely still works. Third, there's a massive untapped opportunity right now in green industrialization, building regional value chains that completely bypass the old carbon-heavy path. But finally, and most importantly, absolutely none of this works without building robust state capacity. You need strong institutions to coordinate these investments and manage the sheer immense pressure of global capital.
The global economy has fundamentally changed, guys. The old rules simply no longer apply. So the billion-dollar question is this: will today's developing nations forge a new path to prosperity, deploying the smart policies and institutional strength needed to build a new ladder? Or are millions going to remain structurally trapped without a way up? If you found this explainer helpful and want to understand more about the macro forces shaping our world, hit that subscribe button for Growth Trap, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and definitely let us know which country's macroeconomy we should break down next.